Man, Timberwolves fans, it really feels like Minnesota is not done, not even close. After everything this team has already done to reshape the roster and put itself in position to chase the best teams in the West, there are still some serious questions hanging over what comes next. And today, we have two big stories to talk about, and both of them point in the same direction. This front office may still be looking for another piece. The first story is all about the trade deadline, because there are already 5 potential targets being discussed who could address some very specific weaknesses on this roster. And when you look at what Minnesota is trying to build right now, some of those possibilities are really interesting. Some feel realistic, some would be much harder to pull off. But there are definitely a couple that made me stop and think. If the Wolves could actually make that happen, we might be talking about a completely different level of team. But then we have the second story, and this one takes things even further. There is a proposed move involving a $90 million power forward that could potentially give Minnesota another major piece next to its superstar core. And considering what this team has already invested to compete right now, the big question becomes pretty simple. How aggressive are the Wolves willing to get before they finally say, this is our championship roster? Because if Minnesota really believes this is the window, standing still might not be enough. And before we get into both stories, if you are enjoying the video, hit that like button and subscribe. I am Henry, and this channel is still brand new, so our first goal is getting this community to 100 subscribers. But seriously, subscribe only if you are a real Timberwolves fan and you actually want to be here talking Wolves basketball with us every day. It would be pretty cool to look back one day and know you were part of this community from the very beginning. Alright, let us get into the first story. So let us start with that first story, because this is where things get really interesting for Minnesota. Jack Simone put together 5 way too early trade deadline targets for the Timberwolves, and the entire idea is built around one question. Now that LaMelo Ball is in Minnesota, what else can this team do to make life easier for him and maximize this championship window? Because the Wolves already made the huge move. They brought in LaMelo Ball. They have Anthony Edwards, and now expectations change immediately. You do not make that kind of commitment just to say that hopefully everything works out. You make that move because you believe you can seriously compete for the Western Conference and ultimately for a championship. And maybe this roster does work perfectly. Maybe Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball become exactly the kind of backcourt Minnesota is hoping for. But there are still areas where this roster could use some help. And the trade deadline gives the Wolves another opportunity to evaluate what they actually have once these guys start playing together. And the first name on Simone's list is Isaiah Stewart. I actually understand the thinking here immediately. When you have LaMelo Ball running your offense, you want to build as strong of a defensive environment around him as possible. Minnesota already has some elite defensive pieces, obviously, but adding another physical defensive-minded big man off the bench could make a lot of sense. Isaiah Stewart could give Minnesota minutes at center whenever Rudy Gobert needs a break. Especially if Joan Behringer is not ready to handle the type of responsibility Minnesota hopes he can eventually handle. And that is important, because I really do not want the Wolves getting to the postseason and suddenly discovering that one of their young guys is not ready for those minutes. That is not even criticism of Behringer. Young players need time. The playoffs are different. Teams hunt weaknesses. Rotations shrink. Every possession gets more physical, and suddenly those 8 or 10 backup center minutes can become incredibly important. Stewart could potentially give you insurance there, and he could probably give Minnesota some minutes at power forward as well. Then we get to the second name, Day'Ron Sharpe. And again, the logic comes back to Joan Behringer. Minnesota clearly seems to believe in Behringer heading into the season. But what happens if the Wolves get halfway through the year and realize he just is not ready for heavy playoff minutes yet? That is where somebody like Day'Ron Sharpe becomes interesting. He could potentially provide relatively affordable center depth and give Minnesota another big body to put around LaMelo Ball. And with the way LaMelo sees the floor and creates opportunities, having multiple big men who can benefit from his passing could become extremely valuable. The third name might be even more interesting from an offensive perspective, Yolan Smith. Because one thing this roster does not really have is an obvious pick-and-pop big for LaMelo to work with. Yolan Smith changes that. He can play some power forward. He can play some center. He gives you additional depth at both positions. But more importantly, he could give LaMelo a different kind of partner in the two-man game. And this is where I think Minnesota has to be smart. It is not just about collecting good players anymore. Once you bring in a player like LaMelo Ball, you have to start asking which players actually complement what he does. Who gives him space? Who can finish the opportunities he creates? Who can defend around him? Who can make the game easier for Anthony Edwards at the same time? Jalen Smith would at least offer a different offensive dimension. But the fourth name is the one that would get me seriously excited. Herb Jones. Come on. If there were actually a realistic opportunity for Minnesota to get Herb Jones from the New Orleans Pelicans, I am making that phone call. Now, obviously, that depends completely on New Orleans being willing to have that conversation. This is not something Minnesota can just decide to do on its own. But purely from a basketball perspective, imagine Herb Jones and Jaden McDaniels defending together on the wings. That could be ridiculous. And again, think about the defensive infrastructure you would be putting around LaMelo Ball. You would have McDaniels, you would potentially have Jones, and you still have Rudy Gobert protecting the paint. That gives you so much defensive versatility around a backcourt built around LaMelo and Anthony Edwards. For me, Herb Jones is the kind of player who makes sense because you do not need him dominating the basketball. You need him defending, making winning plays, and fitting around your stars. And then the fifth name is AJ Green. This one is much more straightforward. LaMelo Ball needs shooters. Period. When you have a passer with that kind of creativity, you want guys standing around him who punish defenses for collapsing. AJ Green has established himself as a high-level three-point shooter with the Milwaukee Bucks. And the appeal for Minnesota would be giving LaMelo another legitimate catch-and-shoot weapon. Because imagine the pressure when Anthony Edwards is attacking, LaMelo is creating, and you have dependable shooting surrounding those actions. That is when the floor starts opening up. So, those are the 5 names Jack Simone identified. Isaiah Stewart, Day'Ron Sharpe, Jalen Smith, Herb Jones, and AJ Green. And remember, these are way too early potential targets. Nobody should hear those names and assume Minnesota is definitely trading for one of them. The point is that the Wolves need to stay flexible. See what works, see what does not. See whether Joan Berringer is ready. See whether the front court needs another body. See whether the offense needs more shooting. And most importantly, see exactly what Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball need once they have actually spent meaningful time playing together. Because the trade deadline should be about solving the problems you discover during the season, not making moves just because you can. But that leads perfectly into our second story, because there is already another potential solution being discussed for arguably one of Minnesota's biggest remaining questions. And this one involves PJ Washington. Minnesota is heading into the 2026-2027 season with enormous expectations after paying a massive price to acquire LaMelo Ball. The Wolves are not just trying to be good anymore. They are trying to prove they belong in the same championship conversation as teams like the Oklahoma City Thunder and San Antonio Spurs. And, according to the report, Minnesota is still looking for a starting power forward after LeBron James chose to sign with the Philadelphia 76ers. That search has already connected the Wolves to another very interesting name, Jonathan Kuminga. John Kravitzinski discussed reporting from Michael Scotto of HoopsType that Minnesota had emerged as a team expressing interest in Kuminga, the 23-year-old free agent swingman. Kravitzinski's explanation was basically that when a player becomes available at a position Minnesota needs to address, of course the Wolves are going to investigate the possibility, and that makes sense. You want an aggressive front office, but there is a major problem with Kuminga money. According to Kravitzinski, Minnesota would only have a minimum offer available for Kuminga in this scenario, while Kuminga's camp has made it clear to interested teams that he wants a significant amount of money. So even if Minnesota could somehow get Kuminga, there is a possibility you are looking at something closer to a short-term solution, potentially even a one-year rental. And that brings us back to Washington of the Dallas Mavericks. The argument made by Adel Ahmed is that Washington could actually be the safer and better fit for Minnesota. And I can see why. PJ Washington is a proven playoff starter. He is a two-way forward. He fills that front court need. And bringing him in would allow Jaden McDaniels to remain primarily at small forward rather than asking him to fill a different role because of the roster construction. The proposed trade is simple on paper. Minnesota receives Washington. Dallas receives Josh Green and a 2029 first-round pick. Now, that first-round pick is where Wolves fans have to think carefully. Minnesota already gave away most of its tradable draft capital in the LaMelo Ball deal. So giving up another first-rounder is not something you do casually. But if you genuinely believe Washington solves a major problem in your starting five and helps turn this roster into a championship-level group, then you at least have to consider it. Especially because Jake Fisher has reported that Dallas is open to moving veteran players such as PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford if the Mavericks can get a first-round pick back. And there is another fascinating part of Fisher's information. According to him, Washington has not actually generated much trade interest around the league recently. Fisher said that Daniel Gafford has received significantly more trade interest than Washington, based on what he has heard. That could matter, because if Minnesota believes Washington is the guy, maybe you explore it before the market becomes crowded closer to the trade deadline. But then we have to ask the most important question. Does PJ Washington really fit this team? For me, the answer makes a lot of sense on paper. Washington has already shown that he can play alongside an elite creator in high-pressure basketball. We saw what he could do alongside Luka Doncic. He does not need to be the offensive centerpiece to impact winning, and that is exactly what Minnesota needs. You already have Anthony Edwards. You already have LaMelo Ball. You are not looking for another player who needs 20 shots every night. You need somebody who understands his role, can defend, can contribute offensively, can survive playoff basketball, and can help balance that starting five. Now, imagine the potential lineup. LaMelo Ball, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, PJ Washington, Rudy Gobert. Guys, that is a serious lineup. You have LaMelo creating, you have Edwards putting pressure on defenses and taking over games. You have McDaniels handling difficult perimeter assignments. You have Washington giving you another two-way front court piece. And you have Gobert protecting the rim. Would that automatically make Minnesota the best team in the Western Conference? No. We still have to see everything work on the floor. Oklahoma City is going to have something to say about that. San Antonio is going to have something to say about that. The West does not give anybody anything for free. But the argument in the report is that a starting five like that could put Minnesota no worse than around third in the Western Conference. And whether you agree with that exact ranking or not, you can understand the excitement. The bigger question for me is how much more Minnesota is willing to sacrifice. That LaMelo Ball trade already represented a massive commitment. Another first-round pick for PJ Washington pushes even more chips toward the middle of the table. At some point, you stop building for some vague future and say that you believe Anthony Edwards can lead you there right now. And maybe that is exactly where this organization is. That is what connects both of today's stories. Whether we are talking about Isaiah Stewart, Darren Sharp, Yolan Smith, Herb Jones, AJ Green, Jonathan Kuminga, or PJ Washington, the message is the same. Minnesota has reasons to keep looking. Some of those players would provide defense. Some would provide front court depth. AJ Green would give LaMelo another shooter. Yolan Smith could provide that pick and pop element. Herb Jones would potentially make an already dangerous defensive lineup absolutely terrifying. And PJ Washington could potentially fill the starting power forward spot with a player who has already proven he can contribute in meaningful playoff games. But Minnesota cannot make these decisions based on names alone. Fit matters. Cost matters. Contract situation matters. And after spending so much to acquire LaMelo, every remaining asset becomes more valuable. That is why this season is going to tell us so much. We finally get to see what LaMelo Ball and Anthony Edwards look like together. We get to see whether Joan Berringer can earn meaningful minutes. We get to see what this front court actually needs. We get to see whether there is enough shooting around the stars. And we get to see whether the current group is capable of going toe-to-toe with the Oklahoma City Thunder, San Antonio Spurs, and everybody else standing between Minnesota and the finals. And if the answer is that they are one piece away, then I want this front office ready. Because opportunities to seriously chase a championship do not last forever. Anthony Edwards is entering the stage of his career where expectations are enormous. LaMelo Ball was brought here for a reason. Rudy Gobert is here to help this team win now. Jaden McDaniels has developed into a critical part of what Minnesota does. If this group proves it has something special, you cannot be afraid to finish the roster. At the same time, you cannot panic and throw away your final assets just because a recognizable player becomes available. That balance is going to define Minnesota's next move. And Wolves fans, I really want to know where you stand on this one. Out of Isaiah Stewart, Darren Sharp, Yolan Smith, Herb Jones, and AJ Green. Who would you want Minnesota targeting at the deadline? And then there is the bigger question. Would you give up Josh Green and that 2029 first-round pick to bring PJ Washington to Minnesota? Or would you rather preserve that pick and see whether another opportunity develops? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I know Wolves fans are going to be divided on this. And if you enjoyed talking Wolves basketball with me today, hit the like button and subscribe to 76ers Daily News. The channel is still new, and we are chasing our first goal of 100 subscribers. But subscribe only if you really believe in this Wolves team and want to be part of this community as we follow everything that happens this season. Because if this roster is as good as we think it could be, this season could get very, very interesting. I am Henry, and I will see you in the next one.